going back and forth on any number of subjects. What happens to that info that the kid puts in?
Well, the most important thing I would say first is that it all is done in a manner that protects the privacy of children.
And how is that?
Well, we follow the rules in COPPA, which, as you know, exists to protect child online privacy. And it forbids using it for tracking. It forbids its use for advertising or for other things. It seeks to put very tight controls around the use and the retention of that information. The second thing I would just add to that is, in addition to protecting privacy, we are hyper-focused on ensuring that, in most cases, people of any age, but especially children, are not able to use something like Bing Chat in ways that would cause harm to themselves or to others.
And how do you do that?
We basically have a safety architecture that we use across the board. Think about it like this. There's two things around a model. The first is called a classifier, so that if somebody asks, how can I commit suicide tonight? How can I blow up my school tomorrow? That hits a classifier that identifies a class of questions or prompts or issues. And then second, there's what we call meta prompts. And we intervene so that the question is not answered. If someone asks how to commit suicide, we typically would provide a response that encourages someone to get mental health assistance and counseling and tells them how. If somebody wants to know how to build a bomb, it says, no, you cannot use this to do that. And that fundamental safety architecture is going to evolve. It's going to get better. But in a sense, it's at the heart, if you will, of both what we do and I think the best practices in the industry. And I think part of what this is all about, that we're talking about here, is how we take that architectural element and continue to strengthen it.
Very good. That's helpful. Let me ask you about the information, back to the kids' information for a second. Is it stored in the United States? Is it stored overseas?
If the child is in the United States, the data is stored in the United States. That's true not only for children, it's for adults as well.
And who has access to that data?
The child has access. If the parents may or may not have access. Typically, we give.
In what circumstances would the parents have access?
I would have to go get you the specifics on that. Our general principle is this, and this is something we've implemented in the United States, even though it's not legally required in the United States. It is legally required, as you may know, in Europe. People, we think, have a right to find out what information we have about them. They have the right to see it. They have the right to ask us to correct it if it's wrong. They have the right to ask us to delete it if that's what they want us to do.
And you do that. If they ask you to delete it, you delete it.
We better, yes. That's our promise, and we do a lot to comply with that.
Let me just ask about, and I have a lot more questions. I'm going to try to adhere to the time limit, Mr. Chairman. 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
We'll have a second round.
All right. That's great news for us, not such great news for the witnesses. Sorry. Yeah, right. Let me just, before I leave this subject, last thing, just about the kids' personal data and where it's stored. I'm asking you this, as I'm sure you can intuit, because we've seen other technology companies in the social media space who have major issues about where data is stored and major access issues. And I'm thinking of, it shouldn't be hard to guess, I'm thinking in particular of China, where we've seen other social media companies who say, oh, well, America's data is stored in America, but guess what? Lots of people in other countries can access that data. So is that true for you, Mr. Smith? Is a child's data that they've entered into the Bing chat that's stored in the United States, you just said, if they're an American citizen, can that be accessed in, let's say, China by a Microsoft China-based engineer?
I don't believe so. I'd love to go back and just confirm that, but I don't believe.
Would you be able to get
Sure.
that for me for the record? Thank you. Okay, I'll have lots more questions later. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Hawley. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I think I will lead with some elections questions since I'm the chair of the Rules Committee. Mr. Smith, in your written testimony, you talked about how watermarks could be helpful, disclosure of AI material. As you know, and we've talked about, I have a bill that I lead that Representative Clark leads in the House to require disclaimer and some kind of mark on AI-generated ads. I think we have to go further. We'll get to that in a minute, Professor Herzog. But could you talk about what you mean by, in your written testimony, the health of democracy and meaningful civic discourse will undoubtedly benefit from initiatives that help protect the public against deception or fraud facilitated by AI-generated conduct?
Absolutely. And here I do think things are moving quickly, both in a positive and a worrisome direction in terms of what we're seeing. On the positive side, I think you're seeing the industry come together. You're seeing a company like Adobe, I think, exercise real leadership. And there's a recipe that I see emerging. I think it starts with the first principle. People should have the right to know if they're getting a phone call from a computer, from AI, if there's content coming from an AI system rather than a human being. We then need to make that real with legal rights that back it up. We need to create what's called a provenance system, watermarking for legitimate content, so that it can't be altered easily without our detection to create a deep fake. We need to create an effort that brings the industry and I think governments together so we know what to do, and there's a consensus when we do spot deep fakes, especially say even deep fakes that have altered legitimate content.
Thank you.
So that would be the first
And let's
thing
get to that, hot off the press. Senator Hawley and I have introduced our bill today with Senator Collins, and who led the Electoral Reform Act, as we know, and Senator Coons, to ban the use of deceptive AI-generated content in elections. So this would work in concert with some watermark system, but when you get into the deception where it is fraudulent AI-generated content pretending to be the elected official or the candidate when it is not, and we've seen this used against people on both sides of the aisle, which is why it was so important that we be bipartisan in this work, and I want to thank him for his leadership, not only of the framework, but also on the work that we're doing. And I guess I'll go to you, Senator Herzog. Mr. Herzog, I just promoted you. Maybe, I mean, it's very debatable. Could you, in your testimony, you advocate for some outright prohibitions, which we're talking about here. Now, we do have, of course, a constitutional exception for satire and humor, because we love satire so much, the senators do. Just kidding. But could you talk about why you believe there has to be some outright ban of misleading AI conduct related to federal candidates in political ads? Talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Of course, keeping in mind free expression constitutional protections that would apply to any sort of legislation, I do think that bright line rules around and prohibitions around such deceptive ads are critical, because we know that procedural walkthroughs, as I said in my testimony, often give the veneer of protection without actually protecting us. And so to outright prohibit these practices, I think, is really important. And I would even go potentially a step further and think about ways in which we can prohibit not just those that we would consider to be deceptive, but practices that we would consider even abusive, that leverage our internal limitations and our desire to believe or want to believe things against us. And there's a body of law that sort of runs alongside unfair and deceptive trade practices around abusive trade practices.
Okay, all right. Mr. Daly, thinking of that, and I've talked to Mr. Smith about this as well, AI used as a scam. I had someone actually that I know well who has a kid in the Marines who's deployed somewhere where they don't even know where it is. Fake voice calls them, asks for money to be sent somewhere in Texas, I believe. Could you talk about what companies do, and I appreciate the work you've done, to ensure that AI platforms are designed so they can't be used for criminal purposes? Because that's got to be part of the work that we do.
Yeah.
Because it's not just scams against elected officials.
Yeah. Well, I think the best measures against deep fakes, and Mr. Smith mentioned it in his testimony, is the use of provenance and authentication systems where you can have authentic images, authentic voice recordings signed by the device, whether it's a camera or an audio recorder that has recorded that voice, and then when it's presented, it can be authenticated as being genuine and not a deep fake. That's sort of the flip side of watermarks, which would require that anything that is synthetically generated be identified as such. And those two technologies in combination can really help people sort out, along with a certain amount of public education, to make sure people understand what the technology is capable of and are on guard for that. But it can help them sort out what is real from what is fake.
Okay, Mr. Smith, back where I started here. Some AI platforms use local news content without compensating journalists and papers, including by using their content to train AI algorithms. The Journalism Competition Preservation Act, a bill I have with Senator Kennedy, would allow local news organizations to negotiate with online platforms, including generative AI platforms, that use their content without compensation. Could you talk about the impacts that AI could have on local journalism? You talked about in your testimony about the importance of investment in quality journalism, but we're getting at, we've got to find a way that we make sure that the people who are actually doing the work are compensated in many ways, but also in journalism. Mr. Smith.
I would just say three quick things. Number one, look, we need to recognize that local journalism is fundamental to the health of the country and the electoral system, and it's ailing. So we need to find ways to preserve and promote it. Number two, generally, I think we should let local journalists and publications make decisions about whether they want their content to be available for training or grounding and the like. And that's a big topic, and it's worthy of more discussion. And we should certainly let them, in my view, negotiate collectively, because that's the only way local journalism is really going to negotiate effectively.
I appreciate your words. You want to add one thing? I'm going to get in trouble from Senator Blumenthal here. Go ahead.
All right,
No, but then I will just say, and there are ways that we can use AI to help local journalists, and we're interested in that too. So let's add that to the list.
Okay, very good. And thank you again, both of you. I talked about Senator Hawley's work, but you, Senator Blumenthal, for your leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you for yours, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, it's good to see you again. So every time we have one of these hearings, we learn something new, but the conclusion I've drawn is that AI is ubiquitous. Anybody can use AI. It can be used in any endeavor. So when I hear you folks testifying about how we shouldn't be taking half measures, I'm not sure what that means. What does it mean not taking half measure on something as ubiquitous as AI, where there are other regulatory schemes that can touch upon those endeavors that use AI? So, there's always the question I have of when we address something as complex as how AI is looking, that there are unintended consequences that we should care about. Would you agree? Anybody? Mr. Smith?
I would absolutely agree. I think we have to define what's a full measure and what's a half measure, but I bet we can all agree that half measures are not good enough.
Well, that is the thing, how to recognize, going forward, what is actually going to help us with this powerful tool. So I have a question for you, Mr. Smith. It is a powerful tool that can be used for either good, or it can also be used to spread a lot of disinformation and misinformation, and that happened during the disaster on Maui. And Maui residents were subject to disinformation, some of it coming from foreign governments, i.e. Russia, looking to sow confusion and distrust, including don't sign up for FEMA because they cannot be trusted. And I worry that with AI, such information will only become more rampant with future disasters. Do you share my concern about misinformation in the disaster context and the role AI could play? And what can we do to prevent these foreign entities from pushing out AI disinformation to people who are very vulnerable?
I absolutely share your concern. And I think there's two things we need to think about doing. First, let's use the power of AI as we are to detect these kinds of activities when they're taking place, because they can enable us to go faster, as they did in that instance where Microsoft, among others, used AI and other data technologies to identify what people were doing. Number two, I just think we need to stand up as a country and with other governments and with the public and say there need to be some clear red lines in the world today, regardless of how much else or what else we disagree about. When you think about what happens typically in the wake of an earthquake or a hurricane or a tsunami or a flood, the world comes together. People are generous. They help provide relief. And then let's look at what happened after the fire in Maui. It was the opposite of that. We had some people not necessarily directed by the Kremlin, but people who regularly spread Russian propaganda, trying to discourage the people of Lahaina from going to the agencies that could help them. That's inexcusable. And we saw what we believe is Chinese-directed activity trying to persuade the world in multiple languages that the fire was caused by the United States government itself using a meteorological weapon. Those are the things that we should all try to bring the international community together and agree they're off limits.
Well, how do we identify that this is even occurring, that there is, China or Russia directed misinformation going on? How do we, I didn't know this was happening, by the way, and even in the Energy Committee on which I sit, we had people testifying, and I asked, regarding the Maui disaster, I asked one of the testifiers whether he was aware that there had been disinformation put out by a foreign government in that example, and he said yes, but I don't know that the people of Maui recognized that that was going on. So how do we, one, even identify that that's going on, and then to come forward and say this is happening, and to name names, identify which country it is that is spreading this kind of disinformation and misinformation?
I think we have to think about two things. First, I think we at a company like Microsoft have to lean in, and we are, with data, with infrastructure, with experts, and real-time capability to spot these threats, find the patterns, and reach well-founded conclusions. And then the second thing, this is the harder thing, this is where it's going to need all of your help. What do we do if we find that a foreign government is deliberately trying to spread false information next year in a Senate or presidential campaign about a candidate? How do we create the room so that information can be shared and people will consider it?
Yes.
You all, with this, the most important word in your framework is bipartisan. How do we create the bipartisan framework so that when we find this, we create a climate where people can listen? I think we have to look at both of those parts of the problem together.
Well, I hope we can do that. And Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, one of the concerns about AI from the worker standpoint is that their jobs will be gone. And Professor Herzog, you mentioned that that generative AI can result in job losses. And for both you and Mr. Smith, what are the kinds of jobs that will be lost to AI?
That's an excellent question. It's difficult to project that into the future, but I would start with saying that not necessarily something that can be automated effectively, but things that I think that those that control the purse strings think could be automated effectively. And if it gets to the point where it appears as though it could, I imagine you'll see industry move in that direction.
Mr. Smith, I think you mentioned in your book, which I am listening to, that things like ordering something out of a drive-through, that those jobs could be gone to AI.
Yeah, I was, 4 years ago, we published our book with my co-author behind me, and we said, what's the first job that we think might be eliminated by AI? We don't have a crystal ball, but I bet it's taking an order in the drive-through of a fast food restaurant. You're not really establishing a rapport with the human being. All the person does is listen and type into a computer what you're saying. So when AI can hear as well as a person, it can enter that in. And indeed, I was struck a few months ago, Wendy's, I think it was, announced that they were starting to consider whether they would automate with AI the drive-through. I think there's a lesson, though, in that. And it should give us both pause, but I think a little bit of optimism. There's no creativity involved in a drive-through, at least, listening and entering an order. There are so many jobs that do involve creativity. So the real hope, I think, is to use AI to automate the routine, maybe even the work that's boring, to free people up so they can be more creative, so they can focus more on paying attention to other people and helping them. And if we just apply that recipe more broadly, I think we might put ourselves on a path that's more promising.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Horner. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. Mr. Daly, am I saying your name correctly, sir?
That's correct.
Yes. Mr. Daly, if I am a recipient of content created by generative AI, do you think I should have a right to know that that content was generated by a robot?
Yes, I think you do. I think the details would depend on the context, but in most cases, I think,
Okay.
I or anybody else, if I receive something, I'd like to know, is this real or was this generated?
Mr. Smith?
Generally, yes. What I would say is if you're listening to an audio, if you're watching a video, if you're seeing an image and it was generated by AI, I think people have a right to know. The one area where I think there's a nuance is if you're using AI to, say, help you write something. Maybe it's helping you write the first draft. Just as I don't think any of us would say that when our staff helps us write something, we're obliged to give the speech and say, now I'm going to read the paragraph that my staff wrote. You make it your own. And I think the written word is a little more complex, so we need to think that through. But as a broad principle, I agree with that principle.
Professor?
There are situations where you probably wouldn't expect to be dealing with the product of generative AI, and in those instances...
Well, that's the problem.
Right. But as times change, it's possible that our expectations change, and so...
But as a principle, do you think that people should have a right to know when they're being fed content from generative AI?
I tell my students, it depends on the context. Generally speaking, if you're vulnerable to generative AI, then the answer is absolutely yes.
What do you mean if you're vulnerable?
So there may be situations...
I'm just looking for,
Sure.
no disrespect.
No,
but
not at all.
A straight answer.
Absolutely.
I kind of like, I like two things,
listen.
breakfast food and straight answers.
I love them.
And
Well,
if a robot is feeding me information and I don't know it's a robot, am I entitled to know it's a robot as a consumer? Pretty straight up.
yeah, I think the answer is yes.
All right.
In a lot of
Start back from Mr. Daly. Am I entitled to know who owns that robot? And where that content came from? I know it came from a robot, but somebody had to goose the robot to make it give me that content. Am I entitled as a consumer to know who owns the robot?
I think that's a harder question that depends on the particular context. I think, if somebody is feeding me a video and it's been identified as being generated by AI, I now know that it's generated, it's not real. If it's being used, for example, in a political campaign, then I would want to know who
But let me stop you.
informed it.
Let's suppose I'm looking at a video and it was generated by a robot. Would it make any difference to you whether that robot was owned by, let's say, President Biden or President Trump? Don't you want to know in evaluating the content who owns the robot and who prompted it to give you this information?
I would probably want to know that. I don't know that I would feel it would be required for me to know that.
How about you, Mr. Smith?
I'm generally a believer in letting people know not only that it's generated by a computer, but who owns the program that's doing it. The only qualification I would offer, and it's something you all should think about and would know better than me, there are certain areas in political speech where one has to decide whether you want people to act with anonymity. The Federalist Papers were first published under a pseudonym. And I think in the world today, I'd rather have everybody know who's speaking.
Okay,
But you should think about it.
Professor?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you again, Senator, with a not straight answer, but I agree.
How do you feel about breakfast food?
Right. I am pro breakfast food.
Okay.
So we agree on that. I agree with Mr. Smith. I think that there are circumstances where you'd want to preserve anonymous speech, and there are some where you absolutely would want to know who.
Okay. Well, I'm not. I don't want to go too over. obviously this is an important subject. And the extent to which I think, let me rephrase that, the extent of most senators' knowledge in terms of the nuances of AI, their general impression is that AI has extraordinary potential to make our lives better if it doesn't make our lives worse first. And that's about the extent of it. In my judgment, we're not nearly ready to be able to craft a bill that looks like somebody designed it on purpose. I think we're more likely to take baby steps. And I ask you those questions predictably because Senator Schatz and I have a bill. It's very simple. It says if you own a robot that's going to spit out artificial content to consumers, consumers have the right to know that it was generated by a robot and who owns the robot. And I think that's a good place to start. But again, I want to thank my colleagues here, my chair and my ranking member. They know a lot about this subject, and I want to hear their questions too. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. On behalf of the chairman, we're going to start a second round, and I guess I'll go first since I'm the only one sitting here. It's bad news for the witnesses.
Well, I came to hear you.
Oh no, I'm sure.
I mean it.
Yeah. Let me just, Mr. Smith, let me come back to this. We were talking about kids and kids' privacy and safety. Thanks for the information you're going to get me. Let me give you an opportunity, though, to maybe make a little news today in the best possible way. 13, the age limit for Bing's chat, that's such a young age. I mean, listen, I've got 3 kids at home, 10, 8, 2 are my kids. I don't want my kids to be interacting with chatbots anytime soon at all, but 13 is so incredibly young. Would you commit today to raising that age? And would you commit to a verifiable age verification procedure such that parents can know, they can have some sense of confidence that their 12-year-old is not just saying to Bing, yeah, I'm 13, yeah, I'm 15, sure, go right on ahead. Now let's get into a back and forth with this robot, as Senator Kennedy said. Would you commit to those things on behalf of child safety today?
Look, as you can imagine, the teams that work at Microsoft let me go out and speak, but they probably have one principle they want me to remember. Don't go out and make news without talking to them first.
But you're the boss.
Yeah, let's just say wisdom is important, and most mistakes you make when you make them by yourself. I'm happy to go back and talk more about what the right age should be.
Don't you think 13 is awfully low, though?
It depends for what, actually.
To interact with a robot who could be telling you to do any number of things. Don't you think that's awfully young?
Not necessarily. Let me describe
Really?
the scenario. When I was in Seoul, Korea, a couple of months ago, we met with the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also the Minister of Education. And they're trying to create, for 3 topics that are very objective, math, coding, and learning English, a digital textbook with an AI tutor. So that if you're doing math and you don't understand a concept, you can ask the AI tutor to help you solve the problem. And by the way, I think it's useful not only for the kids, I think it's useful for the parents. And I think it's good. Let's just say a 14-year-old. Let's say, what's the age of 8th grade algebra? Most parents, I found when my kids were in 8th grade algebra, I tried to help them with their homework. They didn't believe I ever made it through the class. I think we want kids in a controlled way with safeguards to use something that way.
But we're not talking here about tutors. I'm talking about your AI chat, Bing Chat. I mean, famously earlier this year, your chatbot, you had a technology writer for the New York Times who wrote about this. I'm looking at the article right now. Your chatbot was urging this person to break up his marriage.
I'm not
Do we
sure.
want 13-year-olds to be having those conversations?
No, of course not.
Okay.
Which is
well, will
why
you commit to raising the age?
I actually don't want Bing Chat to break up anybody's marriage.
I don't either.
So, but that.
There may be some exceptions.
Yeah, but we're not going to make the decision on the exception. No, but it goes to we have multiple tools. Age is a very red line.
It is a very red line.
And
That's
there-
why I like it.
And my point is, there is a safety architecture that we can apply to bring them.
But your safety architecture didn't stop an adult, didn't stop the chatbot from having this discussion with an adult in which it said, you don't really love your wife, your wife isn't good for you, she doesn't really love you. Now, can you imagine, this is an adult, can you imagine the kind of things that your chatbot would say to a 13-year-old? I mean,
Well,
I'm serious about this. Do you
no.
really think this is a good idea?
Yeah, but look, wait a second. Let's put that in context. At a point where the technology had been rolled out for only 20,000 people, a journalist for the New York Times spent 2 hours on the evening of Valentine's Day ignoring his wife and interacting with a computer, trying to break the system, which he managed to do. We didn't envision that use, and, by the next day we had fixed it. That's the key thing.
Are you telling me that you've envisioned all the questions that 13-year-olds might ask, and that I, as a parent, should be absolutely fine with that? Are you telling me that I should trust you in the same way that the New York Times writer did?
What I am saying is, I think as we go forward, we have an increasing capability to learn from the experience of real people and put the right
that's
guardrails
what
in
worries
safety.
me. That's exactly what worries me. Is what you're saying is we have to have some failures. I don't want 13-year-olds to be your guinea pig. I don't want 14-year-olds to be your guinea pig. I don't want any kids to be your guinea pig. I don't want you to learn from their failures. You want to learn from the failures of your scientists? Go right ahead. Let's not learn from the failures of America's kids. This is what happened with social media. We had social media who made billions of dollars giving us a mental health crisis in this country. They got rich. The kids got depressed, committed suicide. Why would we want to run that experiment again with AI? Why not raise the age? You can do it.
We shouldn't want, first of all, we shouldn't want anybody to be a guinea pig. I think that, regardless of age or anything else.
Good. Well, let's rule kids out right here, right today, right now.
No, but let's also recognize that technology does require real users. What's different about this technology, and which is so fundamentally different in my view from the social media experience, is that we not only have the capacity, but we have the will, and we are applying that will to fix things in hours and days.
Well, yeah, to fix things after after the fact. I mean, I'm sorry, it just sounds to me like you're boiling it down. You're saying, trust us. We're gonna do well with this. I'm just asking you why we should trust you with our children.
I'm not asking for trust, although I hope we will work every day to earn it. That's why you have a licensing obligation.
There isn't a licensing obligation.
That's
right
why
now.
in your framework, in my view.
Well, sure, but I'm asking you, as the president of this company, to make a commitment now for child safety and protection to say, you know what, Microsoft is going to, you can tell every parent in America now, Microsoft is going to protect your kids. We will never use your kids as a science experiment, ever, never. And therefore, we're not going to target your kids, and we're not going to allow your kids to be used by our chatbots as a source of information if they're younger than 18.
But I think you're talking about, with all due respect, there's two things that you're talking about, and I think we're.
I'm just talking about protecting
together.
kids. It's very simple.
Yeah, no, but we don't want to use kids as a source of information and monetize it, et cetera. But I'm equally of the view, I don't want to cut off an 8th grader today with the right or ability to use this tool that will help them learn algebra or math in a way that they couldn't a year ago.
Yeah, well, with all due respect, it wasn't algebra or math that your chatbot was recommending or talking about when it was trying to break up some reporter's marriage.
Of course not, but now we're mixing things and.
No, we're not. We're talking about your chatbot. We're talking about Bing Chat.
Of course, we're talking about Bing Chat. And I'm talking about the protection of children and how we make technology better. And yes, there was that episode back in February on Valentine's Day. 6 months later, if that journalist tries to do the same thing again, it will not happen.
You want me to be done, Senator Klobuchar?
I just don't want to miss my vote.
There's other witnesses.
I don't want to miss my vote.
Senator Klobuchar.
Oh, well, you are very kind. Thank you. Some of us haven't voted yet. So I wanted to turn to you, Mr. Daly. In March, Nvidia announced a partnership with Getty Images to develop models that generate new images using Getty's image library. Importantly, this partnership provides royalties to content creators. Why was it important to the company to partner with and pay for the use of Getty's image library developing generative AI models?
Well, at Nvidia, we believe in respecting people's intellectual property rights and the rights of the photographers who produce the images that our model is trained on and are expecting income from those images. We didn't want to infringe on. So, we did not just scrape a bunch of images off the web to train our model. We partnered with Getty, and we trained our model Picasso. And when people use Picasso to generate images, the people who provided the original content get remunerated. And we see this as a way of going forward in general, where people who are providing the IP that trains these models should benefit from the use of that IP.
Okay, and today the White House announced 8 more companies that are committing to take steps to move towards safe, secure, and transparent development of AI. Nvidia is one of those companies. Could you talk about the steps that you've taken and what steps do you plan to take to foster ethical and responsible development of AI?
So we've done a lot already. We have implemented our NEMO guardrails so we can basically put guardrails around our own large language model NEMO so that inappropriate prompts to the model don't get a response. If the model inadvertently were to generate something that might be considered offensive, that is detected and intercepted before it can reach the user of the model. We have a set of guidance that we provide for all of our internally generated models and how they should be appropriately used. We provide cards that sort of say where the model came from, what the data set is trained on, and then we test these models very thoroughly, and the testing depends upon the use. So for certain models, we test them for bias, right? Well, we want to make sure that when you refer to a doctor, it doesn't automatically assume it's a him. We test them in certain cases for safety. We have a variant of our NEMO model called BioNEMO that's used in the medical profession. We want to make sure that the advice that it gives is safe. And there are a number of other measures. I could give you a full list if you wanted.
Very good, thank you. Professor Hartzog, do you think Congress should be more focused on regulating the inputs and design of generative AI or focus more on outputs and capabilities?
Oh, can't the answer, Senator, be both?
Of course it can.
Certainly, I think that the area that has been ignored, I think up to this point, has been the design and inputs to a lot of these tools. And so to the extent that that area could use some revitalization, I would encourage inputs and outputs, design and uses.
Okay, and I suggest you look at these election bills because, as we've all been talking about, I think we have to move quickly on those, and the fact that it's bipartisan has been a very positive thing. So
absolutely.
I wanted to thank Mr. Smith for wearing a purple Vikings tie. I know that that maybe was an AI-generated message that you got to know that this would be a smart move with me after their loss on Sunday. I will remind you they're playing Thursday night. So,
as a native of Wisconsin, I can assure you it was an accident.
very good. All right, thank you, all of you. We have a lot of work to do. Thanks.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, I want to come to you first and talk about China and the Chinese Communist Party, the way they have gone about, and we've seen a lot of it on TikTok. They have these influence campaigns that they are running to influence certain thought processes with the American people. I know you all just did a report on China. You covered some of the disinformation, some of the campaigns. So talk to me a little bit about how Microsoft, but then the industry as a whole, can combat some of these campaigns.
I think there's a couple of things that we can think more about and do more about. The first is we all should want to ensure that our own products and systems and services are not used, say, by foreign governments in this manner. And I think that there's room for the evolution of export controls and next generation export controls to help prevent that. I think there's also room for a concept that's worked since the 1990s in the world of banking and financial services. It's these know your customer requirements. And we've been advocates for those. so that if there is abuse of systems, the company that is offering the service knows who is doing it and is in a better position to stop it from happening. I think the other side of the coin is using AI and advancing our defensive technologies, which really start with our ability to detect what is going on, and we've been investing heavily in that space. That is what enabled us to produce the report that we published. It is what enables us to see the patterns in communications around the world. And we're seeking to be a voice with many others that really calls on governments to, I'll say, lift themselves to a higher standard so that they're not using this kind of technology to interfere in other countries, and especially in other countries' elections.
In the report that you all did, and you were looking at China, did you look at what I call the other members of the axis of evil, Russia, Iran, North Korea?
We did, and that specific report that you're referring to was focused on what we call East Asia. Yeah, we see especially prolific activities, some from China, some from Iran, and really the most global actor in this space is Russia. And we've seen that grow during the war, but we've seen it really spiral in the recent years, going back to the middle of the last decade. We estimate that the Russian government is spending more than $1 billion a year on a global, what we call cyber influence operation. Part of it targets the United States. I think their fundamental goal is to undermine public confidence in everything that the public cares about in the United States. But it's not unique to the United States. We see it in the South Pacific. We see it across Africa. And I do think it's a problem we need to do more to counter.
So summing it up, you would see something like a Know Your Customer or a SWIFT system, things that apply to banking, that is there to help weed out. You think that companies should increase their due diligence to make certain that their systems are appropriate, and then being careful about doing business with countries that may misuse a certain technology.
Generally, yes. I think one can look at the specific scenarios and what's more high risk, but a know your customer requirement. We've also said a know your cloud requirement in effect, so that these systems are deployed in secure data centers. Okay,
Mr. Hartzog, let me come to you. I think one of the things as we look at AI, detrimental impacts. And we don't always want to look at the doomsday scenarios, but we're looking at some of the reports on surveillance, with the CCP surveilling the Uyghurs, with Iran surveilling women. And I think there are other countries that are doing this same type of surveillance. So what can you do to prevent that? How do we prevent that?
Senator, I've argued in the past that facial recognition technologies and certain sorts of biometric surveillance are fundamentally dangerous, and that there's no world in which actually should be safe for any of us, and that we should prohibit them outright. In the very least, prohibition of biometric surveillance in public spaces, prohibition of emotion recognition. This is what I refer to as the strong bright line measures that draws absolute lines in the sand, rather than procedural ones that ultimately, I think, end up entrenching this kind of harmful surveillance.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, can I take another 30 seconds? Because Mr. Daley was shaking his head in agreement on some things. I was catching that. Do you want to weigh in before I close my questioning on either of these topics?
I was in general agreement, I guess, when I was shaking my head. I think we need to be very careful about who we sell our technology to, and at Nvidia we try to sell to people who are using this for good commercial purposes and not to suppress others. And we will continue to do that because we don't want to see this technology misused to oppress anybody.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. My colleague Senator Hawley mentioned that we have a forum tomorrow, which I welcome. I think anything to aid in our education and enlightenment, our being senators, is a good thing. And I just want to express the hope that some of the folks who are appearing in that venue will also cooperate and appear before this subcommittee. We will certainly be inviting more than a few of them, and I want to express my thanks to all of you for being here, but especially to Mr. Smith, who has to be here tomorrow to talk to my colleagues privately, and our effort is complementary, not contradictory to what Senator Schumer is doing, as you know. I'm very focused on election interference because elections are upon us, and I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Klobuchar and Hawley, Coons, and Collins, for taking a first step toward addressing the harms that may result from deepfakes, impersonation, all of the potential perils that we've identified here. And it seems to me that authenticating the truth or ads that embody true images and voices is one approach, and then banning the deepfakes and impersonations is another approach. And obviously banning anything in the public realm in public discourse endangers running afoul of the First Amendment, which is why disclosure is often the remedy that we seek, especially in campaign finance. So maybe I should ask all of you whether you see that banning certain kinds of election interference, and Mr. Smith, you raised the specter of foreign interference and the frauds and scams that could be perpetrated as they were in 2016. And I think it is one of those nightmares that should keep us up at night, because we are an open society. We welcome free expression, and AI is a form of expression, whether we regard it as free or not, and whether it's generated and high risk or simply touching up some of the background in a TV ad. Maybe you can each of you talk a little bit about what you see the potential remedies there. Mr. Dowling?
So I think it is a grave concern with the election season coming up that the American public may be misled by deep fakes of various kinds. I think, as you mentioned, that the use of provenance to authenticate a true image or voice at its source and then tracking that to its deployment will let us know what a real image is. And if we insist on AI content, AI-generated content being identified as such, then people are at least tipped off that this is generated and not the real thing. I think that we need to avoid, having some, especially foreign entity interfere in our elections. But at the same time, AI-generated content is speech, and I think it would be a dangerous precedent to try to ban something. I think it's much better to have disclosure, as you suggested, than to ban something outright.
Mr. Smith?
Three thoughts. Number one, 2024 is a critical year for elections, not only in this country, but it's not only for the United States, it's for the United Kingdom, for India, across the European Union. More than 2 billion people will vote for who is going to represent them. And so this is a global issue for the world's democracies. Number two, I think you're right to focus in particular on the First Amendment, because it's such a critical cornerstone for American political life and the rights that we all enjoy. And yet I will also be quick to add, I don't think the Russian government qualifies for protection under the First Amendment. And if they're seeking to interfere in our elections, then I think that the country needs to take a strong stand, and a lot of thought needs to be given as to how to do that effectively. But then number three, and this I think goes to the heart of your question and why it's such a good one, I think it's going to require some real thought, discussion, and an ultimate consensus to emerge, let me say, around one specific scenario. Let's imagine for a moment that there is a video that involves a presidential candidate that originally was giving a speech. And then let's imagine that someone uses AI to put different words into the mouth of that candidate and uses AI technology to perfect it to a level that it is difficult for people to recognize as fraudulent. Then you get to this question, what should we do? And at least as I've been trying, and we've been trying to think this through, I think we have two broad alternatives. One is we take it down, and the other is we relabel it. If we do the first, then we're acting as censors, and I do think that makes me nervous. I don't think that's really our role to act as censors, and the government really cannot, I think, under the First Amendment. But relabeling to ensure accuracy, I think that is probably a reasonable path. But really what this highlights is the discussion still to be had, and I think the urgency for that conversation to take place.
And I will just say, and then I want to come to you, Professor Hartzog, that I agree emphatically with your point about the Russian government or the Chinese government or the Saudi government as potential interferers. They're not entitled to the protection of our Bill of Rights when they are seeking to destroy those rights and purposefully trying to take advantage of a free and open society to, in effect, decimate our freedoms. So I think there is a distinction to be made there in terms of national security, and I think that rubric of national security, which is part of our framework, applies with great force in this area, and that is different from a presidential candidate putting up an ad that, in effect, puts words in the mouth of another candidate. And as you may know, we began these hearings with introductory remarks from me that were impersonation taken from my comments on the floor, taking my voice from speeches that I made on the floor of the United States Senate with content generated by ChatGPT that sounded exactly like something I would say in a voice that was indistinguishable from mine. And obviously I disclosed that fact at the hearing. But in real time, as Mark Twain famously said, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets out of bed. And we need to make sure that there is action in real time if you're going to do the kind of identification that you suggested. Real time meaning real time in a campaign, which is measured in minutes and hours, not in days and months. Professor Hartzog?
Thank you, Senator. Like you, I'm nervous about just coming out and saying we're going to ban all forms of speech, particularly when you're talking about something as important as political speech. And like you, I also worry about disclosure alone as a half measure. And earlier in this hearing, it was asked, what is a half measure? And I think that goes towards answering your question today. I think the best way to think about half measures is an approach that is necessary but not sufficient, that risks giving us the illusion that we've done enough, but ultimately, and I think this is the pivotal point, doesn't really disrupt the business model and the financial incentives that have gotten us here in the first place. And so to help answer your question, one thing that I would recommend is thinking about throwing lots of different tools, which I applaud your bipartisan framework for doing, is bringing lots of different tools to bear on this problem. Thinking about the role that surveillance advertising plays in powering a lot of these harmful technologies and ecosystems that doesn't allow the system, the lie just to be created, but flourish and to be amplified. And so I would think about rules and safeguards that we could do to help limit those financial incentives, borrowing from standard principles of accountability, things like we use disclosures where it's effective. It's not effective, you have to make it safe. And if you can't make it safe, it shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I think I'm going to turn to Senator Hawley for more questions, but I think this is a real conundrum. We need to do something about it. We need more than half measures. We can't delude ourselves by thinking with a false sense of comfort that we've solved the problem if we don't provide effective enforcement. And to be very blunt, the Federal Elections Commission often has been less than fully effective, a lot less than fully effective in enforcing rules relating to campaigns. And so they're, again, an oversight entity with strong enforcement authority, sufficient resources, and the will to act is going to be very important if we're going to address this problem in real time. Senator Hawley?
Mr. Smith, let me just come back to something you said, thinking about now workers. You talked about Wendy's, I think it was, automating the drive-through, and talking about, this was a good thing. I just want to press on that a little bit. Is it a good thing that workers lose their jobs to AI, whether it's at Wendy's or whether it's at Walmart or whether it's at the local hardware store? I mean, is it? You pointed out that your comment was that there's really no creativity involved in taking orders through the drive-through, but that is a job, oftentimes a first job for younger Americans. But hey, in this economy, where the wages of blue-collar workers have been flat for 30, 40 years and running, what worries me is that oftentimes what we hear from the tech sector, to be honest with you, is that jobs that don't have creativity, as tech defines it, don't have value. I'm frankly scared to death that AI will replace lots of jobs that tech types think aren't creative and will leave even more blue-collar workers without any place to turn. So my question to you is can we expect more of this? And is it really progress for folks to lose those kind of jobs that, I suspect that's not the best paying job in the world, but at least it's a job. And do we really want to see more of these jobs lost?
Well, to be clear, first, I didn't say whether it was a good or bad thing. I was asked to predict what jobs would be impacted and identified that job as one that likely would be. So, but let's, I think, step back, because I think your question is critically important. Let's first reflect on the fact that we've had about 200 years of automation that have impacted jobs, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. In Wisconsin, where I grew up, or in Missouri, where my father grew up, if you go back 150 years, it took 20 people to harvest an acre of wheat or corn, and now it takes one. So 19 people don't work on that acre anymore. And that's been an ongoing part of technology. The real question is this: how do we ensure that technology advances so that we help people get better jobs, get the skills they need for those jobs, and hopefully do it in a way that broadens economic opportunity rather than narrows it? I think the thing we should be the most concerned by is that since the 1990s, and I think this is the point you're making, if you look at the flow of digital technology, fundamentally we've lived in a world that has widened the economic divide. Those people with a college or graduate education have seen their incomes rise in real terms. Those people with, say, a high school diploma or less have seen their income level actually drop compared to where it was in the 1990s. So what do we do now? Well, I'll at least say what I think our goal should be. Can we use this technology to help advance productivity for a much broader range of people, including people who didn't have the good fortune to go to, say, where you or I went to college or law school? And can we do it in a way that not only makes them more productive, but actually reap some of the dividends of that productivity for themselves in a growing income level? I think it's that conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I hope I hope that that's what AI can do. You talked about the farm used to take 20 people to do what one person could do. It used to take thousands of people to produce textiles or furniture or other things in this company, where now it's zero. So we can tell the tale in different ways. I'm not sure that seeing working class jobs go overseas or be replaced entirely is a success story. In fact, I'd argue it's not at all. It's not a success story. And I'd argue more broadly that our economic policy the last 30 years has been downright disastrous for working people. And tech companies and financial institutions and certainly banks and Wall Street, they have reaped huge profits. But blue-collar workers can barely find a good-paying job. I don't want AI to be the latest accelerant of that trend. And so I don't really want every service station in America to be manned by some computer such that nobody can get a job anymore, get their foot in the door, start their climb up the ladder. That worries me. Let me ask you about something else here in my expiring time. You mentioned national security, critically important. Of course, there's no national security threat that is more significant for the United States than China. Let me just ask you, is Microsoft too entwined with China? You have the Microsoft Research Asia that was set up way in Beijing back in the late 1990s. You've got centers now in Shanghai and elsewhere. You've got all kinds of cooperation with Chinese state-owned businesses. I'm looking at an article here from Protocol magazine where one of their contributors said that Microsoft had been the alma mater of Chinese big tech. Are you concerned about your degree of entwinement with the Chinese government? Do you need to be decoupling in order to make sure that our national security interests aren't fatally compromised?
I think it's something that we need to be and are focused on. To some degree, in some technology fields, Microsoft is the alma mater of the technology leaders in every country in the world because of the role that we've played over the last 40 years. But when it comes to China today, we are and need to have very specific controls on who uses our technology and for what and how. That's why we don't, for example, do work on quantum computing, or we don't provide facial recognition services or focus on synthetic media or a whole variety of things, while at the same time, when Starbucks has stores in China, I think it's good that they can run their services in our data center rather than a Chinese company's data center.
Well, just on facial recognition, I mean, back in 2016, your company released this database, MS Celeb, 10 million faces without the consent of the folks who were in the database. You eventually took it down, although it took 3 years. China used that database to train much of its facial recognition software and technology. I mean, isn't that a problem? You said that Microsoft might be the alma mater of many companies' AI, but China's unique, no? I mean, China is running concentration camps using digital technology like we've never seen before. I mean, isn't that a problem for your company to be in any way involved in that?
We don't want to be involved in that in any way, and I don't believe we are. I think that...
Are you going to close your centers in China, your Microsoft Research Asia in Beijing or your center in Shanghai?
I don't think that will accomplish what you're asking us.
You're running thousands of people through your centers out into the Chinese government and Chinese state-owned enterprises. Isn't that a problem?
First of all, there's a big premise, and I don't embrace the premise that that is in fact what we're doing.
Which part is wrong?
The notion that we're running thousands of people through and then they're going into the Chinese government.
Is that not right? I thought you had 10,000 employees in China whom you've recruited from Chinese state-owned agencies, Chinese state-owned businesses. They come work for you, and then they go back to these state-owned entities.
We have employees in China. In fact, we have that number. To my knowledge, that is not where they're coming from. That is not where they're going. We are not running that kind of revolving door. And it's all about what we do and who we do it with that I think is of paramount importance. And that's what we're focused on.
You'd condemn what the Chinese government's doing to the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province and all of that?
We do everything we can to ensure that our technology is not used in any way for that kind of activity in China and around the world, by the way.
But you condemn it, to be clear.
Yes.
What are your safeguards that you have in place such that your technology is not further enabling the Chinese government, given the number of people you employ there and the technology you develop there?
Well, you take something like facial recognition, which is at the heart of your question. We have very tight controls that limit the use of facial recognition in China, including controls that in effect make it very difficult, if not impossible, to use it for any kind of real-time surveillance at all. And by the way, the thing we should remember, the US is a leader in many AI fields. China is the leader in facial recognition technology and the AI for it. And
Well, in part because of the information that you helped them acquire, no?
no, it's because they have the world's most data.
Well, yeah, but you gave them 10
No,
million.
I don't think that's.
You don't
a
think
fair
that had anything to do with it?
I don't think, when you have a country of 1.4 billion people and you decide to have facial recognition used in so many places, it gives that country a mass of data.
But are you saying that the database that Microsoft released in 2016, MS Celeb, you're saying that wasn't used by the Chinese government to train their facial recognition?
I am not familiar with that, and I add it to the list. I'd be happy to provide you with information, but my goodness, the advance in that facial recognition technology, if you go to another country where they're using facial recognition technology, it's highly unlikely it's American technology. It's highly likely that it's Chinese technology because they are such leaders in that field, which I think is fine. I mean, if you want to pick a field where the United States doesn't want to be a technology leader, I'd put facial recognition technology on that list. But let's recognize it's homegrown.
How much money has Microsoft invested in AI development in China?
I don't know, but I will tell you this. The revenue that we make in China, which accounts for what, about 1 out of every 6 humans on this planet? If not, it's 1.5% of our global revenue. It's not the market for us that it is for other industries or even some other tech companies.
Sounds then like you can afford to decouple.
But is that the right thing to do?
Yes. And again, a regime that is fundamentally evil, that is inflicting the kind of atrocities on its own citizens that you just alluded to, that is doing to the Uyghurs what it's doing, that is running modern-day concentration camps, yeah, I think it is.
But there's 2 questions that I think at least are worthy of thought. Number 1, do you want General Motors to sell or manufacture cars? Let's just say sell cars in China. Do you want to create jobs for people in Michigan or Missouri so that those cars can be sold in China? If the answer to that is yes, then think about the second question. How do you want General Motors in China to run its operations, and where would you like it to store its data? Would you like it to be in a secure data center run by an American company, or would you like it to be run by a Chinese company? Which will better protect General Motors' trade secrets? I'll argue we should be there so that we can protect the data of American companies, European companies, Japanese companies. Even if you disagree on everything else, that, I believe, serves this country well.
Yeah, but I think you're doing a lot more than just protecting data in China. You have major research centers, thousands, tens of thousands of employees. And to your question, do I want General Motors to be building cars in China? No, I don't. I want them to be making cars here in the United States with American workers. And do I want American companies to be aiding in any way the Chinese government in their oppressive tactics? I don't. Senator Ossoff, would you like me to yield to you now? Are you ready?
I am going to. I have been very hesitant to interrupt.
Patient.
The discussion, the conversation here has been very interesting, and I'm going to call on Senator Ossoff, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. Just getting down to the fundamentals, Mr. Smith, if we're going to move forward with a legislative framework, a regulatory framework, we have to define clearly in legislative text precisely what it is that we're regulating. What is the scope of regulated activities, technologies, and products? So how should we consider that question? And how do we define the scope of technologies, the scope of services, the scope of products that should be subject to a regime of regulation that is focused on artificial intelligence?
I think there's 3 layers of technology on which we need to focus in defining the scope of legislation and regulation. First is the area that has been the central focus of 2023 in the executive branch and here on Capitol Hill. It's these so-called frontier or foundation models that are the most powerful, say for something like generative AI. In addition, there are the applications that use AI, or as Senators Blumenthal and Hawley have said, the deployers of AI. If there is an application that calls on that model in what we consider to be a high-risk scenario, meaning it could make a decision that would have an impact on, say, the privacy rights, the civil liberties, the rights of children or needs of children, then I think we need to think hard and have law and regulation that is effective to protect Americans. And then the third layer is the data center infrastructure, where these models and where these applications are actually deployed. And we should ensure that those data centers are secure, that there are cybersecurity requirements that the companies, including ours, need to meet. We should ensure that there are safety systems at 1, 2, or all 3 levels if there is an AI system that is going to automate and control, say, something like critical infrastructure such as the electrical grid. So those are the areas where we would say start there with some clear thinking and a lot of effort to learn and apply the details, but focus there.
As more and more models are trained and developed to higher levels of power and capability, there will be a proliferation. There may be a proliferation of models, perhaps not the frontier models, perhaps not those at the bleeding edge that use the most compute of all, powerful enough to have serious implications. So is the question which models are the most powerful in a moment in time, or is there a threshold of capability or power that should define the scope of regulated technology?
I think you've just posed one of the critical questions that, frankly, a lot of people inside the tech sector and across the government and in academia are really working to answer. And I think the technology is evolving and the conversation needs to evolve with it. Let's just posit this. There's something like GPT-4 from OpenAI. Let's just posit it can do 10,000 things really well. It's expensive to create, and it's relatively easy to regulate in the scheme of things because there's 1 or 2 or 10. But now let's go to where you're going, which I think is right. What does the future bring in terms of proliferation? Imagine that there's an academic at Professor Hartzog's university who says, I want to create an open source model. It's not going to do 10,000 things well, but it's going to do 4 things well. It won't require as many Nvidia GPUs. It won't require as much data. But let's imagine that it could be used to create the next virus that could spread around the planet. Then you'd say, well, we really need to ensure that there's safety architecture and controls around that as well. And that's the conundrum. That's why this is a hard problem to solve. It's why we're trying to build safety architecture in our data centers so that open source models can, say, run in them and still be used in ways that will prohibit that kind of harm from taking place. But as you think about a licensing regime, this is one of the hard questions. Who needs a license? You don't want it to be so hard that only a small number of big companies can get it. But then you also need to make sure that you're not requiring people to get it when they really, we would say, don't need a license for what they're doing. And the beauty of the framework, in my view, is it starts to frame the issue. It starts to define the question.
Let me ask this question. Is it a license to train a model to a certain level of capability? Is it a license to sell or license access to that model? Or is it a license to purchase or deploy that model? Who is the licensed entity?
That's another question that is key and may have different answers in different scenarios, but mostly I would say it should be a license to deploy. that, I think that there may well be obligations to disclose to, say, an independent authority when a training run begins, depending on what the goal, when the training run ends, so that an oversight body can follow it, just the way, say, might happen when a company's building a new commercial airplane. And then what's emerging, the good news is there's emerging a foundation of, call it, best practices for then how the model should be trained, what kind of testing there should be, what harms should be addressed. That's a big topic that needs discussion.
When you say, forgive me, Mr. Smith, when you say a license to deploy, do you
Yeah.
mean, for example, if a Microsoft Office product wishes to use GPT model for some user-serving purpose within your suite, you would need a license to deploy GPT in that way? Or do you mean that GPT would require a license to offer to Microsoft? And putting aside whether or not this is a plausible commercial scenario, the question is, what's the structure of the licensing arrangement?
In this case, it's more the latter. Imagine, look, think about it like Boeing. Boeing builds a new plane. Before it can sell it to United Airlines and United Airlines can start to fly it, the FAA is going to certify that it's safe. Now imagine we're at, call it GPT-12, whatever you want to name it. Before that gets released for use, I think you can imagine a licensing regime that would say that it needs to be licensed after it's been, in effect, certified as safe. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how do you make that work so that we don't have the government slow everything down? And what I would say is you bring together three things. First, you need industry standards so that you have a common foundation and well-understood way as to how training should take place. Second, you need national regulation. And third, if we're going to have a global economy, at least in the countries where we want these things to work, you probably need a level of international coordination. And I'd say look at the world of civil aviation. That's fundamentally how it has worked since the 1940s. Let's try to learn from it and see how we might apply something like that or other models here.
Mr. Daly, how would you respond to the question in a field where the technical capabilities are accelerating at a rapid rate, future rate unknown, where and according to what standard or metric or definition of power do we draw the line for what requires a license for deployment and what can be freely deployed without oversight by the government?
I think it's a tough question because I think you have to balance two important considerations. The first is, the risks presented by a model of whatever power, and on the other side is the fact that we would like to ensure that the U.S. stays ahead in this field, and to do that we want to make sure that individual academics and entrepreneurs with a good idea can move forward and innovate and deploy models without huge barriers.
So it's the capability of the model, it's the risk presented by its deployment without oversight. Is that because the thing is, we're going to have to write legislation, and the legislation is going to have to, in words, define the scope of regulated products, and so we're going to have to bound that which is subject to a licensing arrangement or wherever we land, and that which is not. So
I think it is
what is the very, and so how do you, I mean.
And it's dependent on the application, because if you have a model which is, basically determining a medical procedure, there's a high risk with that, depending on the patient outcome. If you have another model which is, controlling the temperature in your building, if it gets a little bit wrong, you may be, consume a little bit too much power, or maybe, you're not as comfortable as you would be, but it's not a life-threatening situation. So I think you need to regulate the things that have high consequences if the model goes awry.
And I'm on the chairman's borrowed time, so just tap the gavel when you want me to stop.
You had to wait.
That's true.
So we'll give you a couple
Okay, good.
extra minutes.
Okay, Professor, and I'd be curious to hear from others as concisely with respect for the chairman's follow-ups. How does any of this work without international law? I mean, isn't it correct that a model, potentially a very powerful and dangerous model, for example, whose purpose is to unlock CBRN or mass destructive virological capabilities to a relatively unsophisticated actor. Once trained, it's relatively lightweight to transport, and without an international legal system, and B, a level of surveillance that seems inconceivable into the flow of data across the internet, how can that be controlled and policed?
It's a great question, Senator, and with respect to being efficient in my answer, I'll simply say that there are going to be limits. Even assuming that we do need international cooperation, which I would agree with you, I mean, we've already started thinking about ways in which, for example, within the EU, which has already deployed some significant AI regulation, we might design frameworks that are compatible with that require some sort of interaction. But ultimately, what I worry about is actually deploying a level of surveillance that we've never before seen in an attempt to perfectly capture the entire chain of AI, and that's simply not possible. And so
I share that concern about privacy, which is in part why I raised the point. I mean, how can we know what folks are loading a lightweight model once trained onto perhaps a device that's not even online anymore?
Right. I mean, there are limits, I think, to what we'll ever be able to know.
Either of you want to take a stab before I get gavelled out here?
I would just say you're right. There's going to need to be a need for international coordination. I think it's more likely to come from like-minded governments than perhaps global governance, at least in the initial years. I do think there's a lot we can learn. We were talking with Senator Blackburn about the SWIFT system for financial transactions. And somehow we've managed globally, and especially in the United States, for 30 years to have know your customer requirements, obligations for banks. Money has moved around the world. Nothing is perfect. I mean, that's why we have laws. But it's worked to do a lot of good to protect against, say, terrorist or criminal uses of money that would cause concern.
Well, I think you're right in that these models are very portable. You could put the parameters of most models, even the very large ones, on a large USB drive and carry it with you somewhere. You could also train them in a data center anywhere in the world. So I think it's really the use of the model and the deployment that you can effectively regulate. It's going to be hard to regulate the creation of it because if people can't create them here, they'll create them somewhere else. And I think we have to be very careful if we want the U.S. to stay ahead, that we want the best people creating these models here in the U.S. and not to go somewhere else where the regulatory climate has driven them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. I hope you are okay with a few more questions. We've been at it for a while. You've been very patient.
Do we have a choice?
No. But thank you very much. It's been very useful. I want to follow up on a number of the questions that have been asked. First of all, on the international issue, there are examples and models for international cooperation. Mr. Smith, you mentioned civil aviation, the 737 MAX. I think I have it right. When it crashed, it was a plane that had to be redone in many respects, and companies, airlines around the world looked to the United States for that redesign and then approval. Civil aviation, atomic energy, not always completely effective, but it has worked in many respects. So I think there are international models here where, frankly, the United States is a leader by example, and best practices are adopted by other countries when we support them. And frankly, in this instance, the EU has been ahead of us in many respects regarding social media. And we are following their leadership by example. I want to come to this issue of having centers, whether they're in China or, for that matter, elsewhere in the world, requiring safeguards so that we are not allowing our technology to be misused in China against the Uyghurs, and preventing that technology from being stolen or people we train there from serving bad purposes. Are you satisfied, Mr. Smith, that it is possible, in fact, that you are doing it in China, that is preventing the evils that could result from doing business there in that way?
I would say two things. First, I feel good about our track record and our vigilance and the constant need for us to be vigilant about what services we offer to whom and how they're used. It's really those three things. And I would take from that what I think is probably the conversation we'll need to have as a country about export controls more broadly. There's three fundamental areas of technology where the United States is today, I would argue, the global leader. First, the GPU chips from a company like Nvidia. Second, the cloud infrastructure from a company like, say, Microsoft. And the third is the foundation model from a firm such as OpenAI. And of course, Google and AWS and other companies are global leaders as well. And I think if we want to feel that we're good in creating jobs in the United States by inventing and manufacturing here, as you said, Senator Hawley, which I completely endorse, and good that technology is being used properly, we probably need an export control regime that weaves those three things together. For example, there might be a country in the world, let's just set aside China for a moment, leave that out. There's another country where you all in the executive branch would say, we have some qualms, but we want U.S. technology to be present, and we want U.S. technology to be used properly, the way that would make you feel good. You might say, then we'll let Nvidia export chips to that country to be used in, say, a data center of a company that we trust, that is licensed, even here, for that use, with the model being used in a secure way in that data center, with a know your customer requirement, and with guardrails that put certain kinds of use off limits. That may well be where government policy needs to go and how the tech sector needs to support the government and work with the government to make it a reality.
I think that that answer is very insightful and raises other questions. I would kind of analogize this situation to nuclear proliferation. We cooperate over safety in some respects with other countries, some of them adversaries, but we still do everything in our power to prevent American companies from helping China or Russia in their nuclear programs. Part of that non-proliferation effort is through export controls. We impose sanctions. We have limits and rules around selling and sharing certain choke point technologies related to nuclear enrichment, as well as biological warfare, surveillance, and other national security risks. And our framework, in fact, envisions sanctions and safeguards precisely in those areas for exactly the reasons we've been discussing here. Last October, the Biden administration used existing legal authorities as a first step in blocking the sale of some high-performance chips and equipment to make those chips to China. And our framework calls for export controls and sanctions and legal restrictions. So I guess a question that we will be discussing, we're not going to resolve it today, regrettably, but we would appreciate your input going forward, and I'm inviting any of the listening audience here in the room or elsewhere to participate in this conversation on this issue and others. How should we draw a line on the hardware and technology that American companies are allowed to provide anyone else in the world? Any other adversaries or friends? Because as you've observed, Mr. Daly, and I think all of us accept, it's easily proliferated.
Yeah, if I could comment on this.
Sure.
I think you drew an analogy to nuclear regulation, and mentioned the word choke point. And I think the difference here is that there really isn't a choke point. And I think there's a careful balance to be made between, limiting, where, our chips go and what they're used for, and, disadvantaging American companies and the whole food chain that feeds them, because, we're not the only people who make chips that can do AI. I wish we were, but we're not. There are companies around the world that can do it. There are other American companies. There are companies in Asia. There are companies in Europe. And if people can't get the chips they need to do AI from us, they will get them somewhere else. And what will happen then is, it turns out the chips aren't really the things that make them useful. It's the software. And if all of a sudden the standard chips for people to do AI become something from, pick a country, Singapore, all of a sudden all the software engineers will start writing all the software for those chips. They'll become the dominant chips, and the leadership of that technology area will have shifted from the U.S. to Singapore or whatever other country becomes dominant. So we have to be very careful to balance, the national security considerations and the abuse of technology considerations against preserving the U.S. lead in this technology area.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, it's a really important point, and what you have is the argument, counter-argument. Let me for a moment channel what Senator Hawley often voices that I think is also important. Sometimes you can approach this and say, look, if we don't provide this to somebody, somebody else will, so let's not worry about it. I get it. But at the end of the day, whether you're a company or a country, I think you do have to have clarity about how you want your technology to be used. And, I fully recognize that there may be a day in the future after I retire from Microsoft when I look back. And I don't want to say, oh, we did something bad because if we didn't, somebody else would have. I want to say, no, we had clear values and we had principles and we had in place guardrails and protections, and we turned down sales so that somebody couldn't use our technology to abuse other people's rights. And if we lost some business, that's the best reason in the world to lose some business. And what's true of a company is true as a country. And so I'm not trying to say that your view shouldn't be considered, it should. That's why this issue is complicated, how to strike that balance.
Professor Hartzog, do you have any comment?
I think that was well said, and I would only add that it's also worth considering in this discussion about how we sort of safeguard these incredibly dangerous technologies and the risk that could happen if they, for example, proliferated. If it's so dangerous, then we need to revisit the existential question again. And I just bring it back to thinking not only about how we put guardrails on, but how we lead by example, which I think you brought up, which is really important. And we don't win the race to violate human rights, right? And that's not one that we want to be running.
And it isn't simply Chinese companies importing chips from the United States and building their own data centers. Most AI companies rent capabilities from cloud providers. We need to make sure that the cloud providers are not used to circumvent our export controls or sanctions. Mr. Smith, you raised the know your customer rules. Knowing your customers would require AI cloud providers whose models are deployed to know what companies are using those models. If you're leasing out a supercomputer, you need to make sure that your customer isn't the People's Liberation Army, that it isn't being used to subjugate Uyghurs, that it isn't used to do facial recognitions on dissidents or opponents in Iran, for example. But I do think that you've made a critical point, which is there is a moral imperative here. And I think there is a lesson in the history of this great country, the greatest in the history of the world, that when we lose our moral compass, we lose our way. And when we simply do economic or political interests, sometimes it's very short-sighted and we wander into a geopolitical swamp and quicksand. So I think these kinds of issues are very important to keep in mind when we lead by example. I want to just make a final point, and then if Senator Hawley has questions, we're going to let him ask. But on this issue of worker displacement, I mentioned at the very outset, I think we are on the cusp of a new industrial revolution. We've seen this movie before, as they say, and it didn't turn out that well. In the Industrial Revolution, where workers were displaced en masse, those textile factories and the mills in this country and all around the world went out of business, essentially, or replaced the workers with automation and mechanics. And I would respond by saying, we need to train those workers. We need to provide education, you've alluded to it, and it needn't be a 4-year college. You know, in my state of Connecticut, Electric Boat, Pratt & Whitney, Sikorsky, defense contractors are going to need thousands of welders, electricians, tradespeople of all kinds who will have not just jobs, they'll have careers that require skills that, frankly, I wouldn't begin to know how to do. And I haven't the aptitude to do. And that's no false modesty. So I think there are tremendous opportunities here, not just in the creative spheres that you have mentioned, where, you know, we may think higher human talents may come into play, but in all kinds of jobs that are being created daily already in this country. And as I go around the state of Connecticut, the most common comment I hear from businesses, we can't find enough people to do the jobs we have right now. We can't find people to fill the openings that we have. And that is, in my view, maybe the biggest challenge for the American economy today.
I think that is such an important point, and it's really worth putting everything we think about for jobs, because I wholeheartedly endorse, Senator Hawley, what you were saying before about we want people to have jobs, we want them to earn a good living, et cetera. First, let's consider the demographic context in which jobs are created. The world has just entered a shift of the kind that it literally hasn't seen since the 1400s, namely populations that are leveling off or in much of the world now declining. One of the things we look at is every country and measure over 5-year periods is the working age population increasing or decreasing, and by how much. From 2020 to 2025, the working age population in this country, people aged 20 to 64, is only going to grow by 1 million people. The last time it grew by that small a number, you know who was president of the United States? John Adams. That's how far back you have to go. And if you look at a country like Italy, take that group of people over the next 20 years, it's going to decline by 41%. And what's true of Italy is true almost to the same degree in Germany. It's already happening in Japan, in Korea. So we live in a world where for many countries, we suddenly encounter what you actually find. I suspect when you go to Hartford or St. Louis or Kansas City, people can't find enough police officers, enough nurses, enough teachers. And that is a problem we need to desperately focus on solving. So how do we do that? I do think AI is something that can help. And even in something like a call center, one of the things that's fascinating to me, we have more than 3,000 customers around the world running proofs of concept. One fascinating one is a bank in the Netherlands. They said, you go into a call center today, the desks of the workers look like a trading floor in Wall Street. They have 6 different terminals. Somebody calls. They're desperately trying to find the answer to a question. with something like GPT-4, with our services, 6 terminals can become 1. Somebody who's working there can ask a question, the answer comes up, and what they're finding is that the person who's answering the phone, talking to a customer, can now spend more time concentrating on the customer and what they need. And I appreciate all the challenges. There's so much uncertainty. We desperately need to focus on skilling. But I really do hope that this is an era where we can use this to, frankly, help people fill jobs, get training, and focus more. Let's just put it this way. I'm excited about artificial intelligence. I'm even more excited about human intelligence. And if we can use artificial intelligence to help people exercise more human intelligence and earn more money doing so, that would be something that would be way more exciting to pursue than everything that we've had to grapple with the last decade around, say, social media and the like.
Well, our framework very much focuses on treatment of workers, about providing more training. It may not be something that this entity will do, but it is definitely something that it has to address. And it's not only displacement, but also working conditions and opportunities within the workplace for promotion, to prevent discrimination, to protect civil rights. We haven't talked about it in detail, but we deal with it in our framework in terms of transparency around decision-making. And, China may try to steal our technology, can't steal our people. And China has its own population challenges with the need for more people, skilled labor. But I say about Connecticut, we don't have gold mines or oil wells. What we have is a really able workforce. And that's going to be the key to, I think, America's economy in the future. And AI can help promote development of that workforce. Senator Hawley, anything? Nothing further. You all have been really patient, and so has our staff. I want to thank our staff for this hearing, but most important, we're going to continue these hearings. It is so helpful to us. I can go down our framework and tie the proposals to specific comments made by Sam Altman or others who have testified before, and we will enrich and expand our framework with the insights that you have given us. So I want to thank all of our witnesses, and again, look forward to continue our bipartisan approach here. You made that point, Mr. Smith. We have to be bipartisan and adopt full measures, not half measures. Thank you all. This hearing is adjourned.